What's up everybody, my name is Phosphoros and today I'm going to be teaching you how to play Sunfury Arcane in the War Within patch 11.0. I'll be telling you exactly what to press in ward order for optimal damage, so let's get right into it. So first up, let's take a look at our talents. On the general tree highlighted in green, you'll see the talents that I consider to be a requirement. These are talents that will give you a direct damage increase and should be included in every build. As for the rest of the talents, it's all up to you based on what you feel you need. I like going mostly defensive talents in Arcane Warding, Winter's Protection, Tempest Barrier, Cryo Freeze, Diverted Energy, Accumulative Shielding, and Barrier Diffusion. Mass Barrier and Ice Cold are also really good talents that I highly recommend in pretty much all content. The only exception is you may not want to take Ice Cold if there's a mechanic that you'd rather immune with Ice Block. Keep in mind also that Ice Cold interacts with both Cryo Freeze and Winter's Protection, so you can actually heal for a good chunk of your health over the duration in addition to a 70% damage reduction. Onto the Arcane tree, this is the pure single target build. The single target build revolves mainly around abusing nether precision by weaving arcane missiles together with arcane blasts and arcane barrages. The most notable talents here are Evocation, Arcane Surge, and Touch of the Magi, as these are our major cooldowns. I also want to draw attention to Aether Attunement. This is an important spell to track as it will cause your next arcane missiles to deal 100% increased damage as well as cleave onto nearby targets after you've consumed 3 clearcasting stacks. All the other talents on the Arcane tree just serve to buff our spells here and there and aren't really that important. Moving on to the Sunfury tree, you want to make sure you're tracking Spellfire Spheres. This is a passive that causes you to gain a stacking buff anytime you cast Arcane Blast or Arcane Barrage. Once that buff reaches 6 stacks, it'll generate a Spellfire Sphere. Generating Spellfire Spheres is important because it'll give you a 2% damage buff, but even more importantly, it'll give you a stack of Burden of Power. Burden of Power causes your next Arcane Blast or Arcane Barrage to deal 30% increased damage, and this damage increase stacks with Nether Precision's damage increase, so it's very important that we play around Burden of Power as much as possible. And lastly, you want to track the Sunfury capstone, Arcane Soul. Arcane Soul is a buff you get whenever Arcane Surge expires that, for the entire duration, will cause your Arcane Barrage to refund 4 arcane charges and also guarantees you a clearcasting stack. We'll go more in depth on all these talents and how to play around them optimally in the next sections, but before that, let's cover some other talent builds. This is the Raid Cleave build. This build removes points in Prodigious Savant in order to allocate them on High Voltage and Orb Barrage instead. These two talents work to increase our arcane charge generation, which will allow us to use Arcane Barrage for Cleave much more often. And lastly, this is the Mythic Plus build. This build is pretty much the same on the Arcane tree as the Raid Cleave build, but the general tree talents are much more optimized around providing utility in a dungeon environment. Remember, you can always mix and match talents on the general tree as you see fit for each dungeon. So what does Arcane's damage pattern look like? Arcane is a very ebb and flow style to its damage pattern. About every 45 seconds you'll have a big burn with Arcane Surge, followed by a period of low filler damage, into a mini burn, followed by another period of low filler damage, and then the cycle repeats. I'll be explaining each of these rotations next, but first, I need to cover some important terminology. So the first term I'll cover here is Spellqueuing. Spellqueuing is the act of beginning the cast on one spell, and then as that cast is ending, you begin pressing the keybind for your next spell. Doing this will queue up your second spell to begin casting immediately when the first cast ends, and this is useful because it leaves no gap in casting between the two spells. This is also important to understand our next term, double dipping. So what is double dipping? Well, whenever you spellqueue an instant cast spell with a casted spell, very often the instant cast spell will be affected by whatever buffs were present when the casted spell ended. So why is this important for Arcane? Well, when you look at the tooltip for Nether Precision and Burden of Power, they say that they will buff your next Arcane Blast or Arcane Barrage. However, if you spellqueue Arcane Blast and Arcane Barrage together, you can actually get the buff on both your next Arcane Blast and your Arcane Barrage. This is why it's so important to understand these interactions, and I'll be telling you when you should or shouldn't spellqueue in the next section. And lastly, let's talk about clipping. Clipping is the act of interrupting any channeled spell with a different spell. In Arcane's case, this would most of the time mean interrupting an Arcane Missile's channel with an Arcane Blast cast. The main reason we do this is because a lot of our damage comes from the nether precision stacks gained from casting arcane missiles rather than the actual missiles themselves. At the moment, the general rule for Arcane is to clip every arcane missile's cast unless you have an Aether Attunement proc. When you have an Aether Attunement proc, you let the cast fully channel. Alright, now that that's all out of the way, let's head into the single target rotation. So usually I explain the rotation starting from the Arcane Surge burn, but this time around I'm going to start with the filler rotation. The reason for this is that Arcane's filler rotation now has a lot more depth than previous iterations of the spec, and even inside our major cooldown windows we're actually doing the filler rotation for optimal damage, so I feel it's important we cover that first. So the filler rotation follows a simple priority list. Cast Arcane Orb whenever you have less than 2 arcane charges, Spellqueue Arcane Barrage with Arcane Blast if you have Burden of Power, Spellqueue Arcane Barrage with Arcane Blast whenever you have your 4-set bonus and 1 stack of Nether Precision, cast Arcane Blast with Nether Precision, cast Arcane Missiles with Clear Casting and make sure you clip this cast unless you have an Aether Attunement proc, cast a regular Arcane Blast, and finally, cast Arcane Barrage if you run out of mana. So that covers the filler rotation. Now let's talk about the burns. So for the Arcane Surge burn, about 3 seconds before the pull starts, you want to cast Evocation to start stacking the damage buff and to generate 1 stack of Clear Casting. As soon as the pull begins, cast Arcane Missiles and clip the channel with an Arcane Surge cast. You're then going to Spellqueue Touch of the Magi at the end of Arcane Surge, then enter the filler rotation. From here, just follow the filler rotation until Arcane Surge ends and you get the Arcane Soul buff. Now during this Arcane Soul window, we're going to follow a new priority list. So our number 1 goal during the Arcane Soul window is to end this window with 3 stacks of Clear Casting. So as soon as you get Arcane Soul, spam Arcane Barrage until you have 3 stacks of Clear Casting. Once you reach 3 stacks, you might still have some time left inside of Arcane Soul, so at this point you can either cast Arcane Missiles into Arcane Barrage, or if you're on the final global cooldown of Arcane Soul, you just Barrage no matter what. Because remember, we want to end this window with 3 stacks of Clear Casting. This means you only cast an Arcane Missiles during this window if you have enough time to fit a Barrage in as well. After Arcane Soul you cast Shifting Power, and that's the end of the Arcane Surge burn. From here, just enter into the filler rotation until Touch of the Magi is back off cooldown, and then you're ready to enter the mini burn. The mini burn is very simple now. When Touch of the Magi is coming off cooldown, you cast Arcane Barrage, then cast Touch of the Magi while Barrage is traveling but before it lands. Then, you enter the filler rotation. From here, you pretty much stick to the filler rotation all the way until Evocation's back off cooldown, and the rotation effectively resets back to the Arcane Surge burn stage. Here's a quick 3-minute segment of me performing the single target rotation on a training dummy. Keep in mind I don't have any tier in this demonstration, so I won't be following that specific line in the priority list, but other than that, I'll have text pop up showing what part of the rotation I'm in so you can follow along, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments. Now let's head into the AoE portion of the guide. As Sunfury, we want to begin using the AoE rotation when we reach 5 targets, and the AoE rotation is very similar to the single target rotation. So here's what the filler priority list looks like. Spellqueue Arcane Barrage with Arcane Blast if you have Burden of Power. Spellqueue Arcane Barrage with Arcane Blast when you have your 4-piece bonus and 1 stack of Nether Precision. Spellqueue Arcane Barrage with Arcane Blast with 1 stack of Nether Precision if you have either an Arcane Orb charge or a Clearcasting stack. Cast Arcane Missiles with Clearcasting if you don't have Nether Precision or if you need Arcane charges. Cast Arcane Orb whenever you have less than 2 Arcane charges. Cast Arcane Blast with Nether Precision. Cast Arcane Explosion if you have 0 Arcane charges. And finally, cast a regular Arcane Blast, or cast Arcane Barrage if you happen to run out of mana. So this is pretty much the same rotation as single target, except now you're barraging at 1 stack of Nether Precision if you have some way to regenerate Arcane charges back quickly through an Arcane Orb cast, or an Arcane Missiles cast by taking advantage of the High Voltage talent. Now let's take a look at the Surge burn. You want to enter the burn with 4 Arcane charges so that you can save a stack of Arcane Orb, but let's assume here that you don't have any charges. Cast Evocation for the damage buff and a stack of Clearcasting, then cast Arcane Orb to get 4 Arcane charges. Next, cast Arcane Missiles for the Nether Precision stacks, and then cast Arcane Surge. At the end of this Surge cast, we want to Spellqueue an Arcane Barrage, then cast Touch of the Magi while Barrage is traveling but before it lands. At this point we still have 1 stack of Nether Precision left, and we still have at least 1 stack of Clearcasting from Arcane Surge. So cast Arcane Blast with an Arcane Barrage spellqueued into it, and then you're free to enter the filler rotation. Once Arcane Surge ends and you're in the Arcane Soul window, follow the same Arcane Soul priority list that we described in the earlier section, then after Arcane Soul ends, cast Shifting Power, and that's the end of the Arcane Surge burn. From here, just enter into the filler rotation until Touch of the Magi is back off cooldown, and then you're ready to enter the mini burn. Similar to the single target rotation, the mini burn is very simple. When Touch of the Magi is coming off cooldown, you cast Arcane Barrage, then cast Touch of the Magi while Barrage is traveling but before it lands. Then, enter the filler rotation. Stick to the filler rotation all the way until Evocation's back off cooldown, and the rotation effectively resets back to the Arcane Surge burn stage. Here's a quick 2-minute segment of me performing the AoE rotation on a group of training dummies. Keep in mind that in this clip I'm getting multiple burns out, but in a Mythic Plus scenario, you'll mostly be alternating between the Arcane Surge burn and the mini burn between packs. Alright guys, that's the end of the video. I hope this saved you some time and brought you up to speed. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to ask in the comments. I'm very active there. Please subscribe, I appreciate the support, and I wish you a very nice day. Take care.